Miss Louisa Hawke had been asked to leave the dinner table at Gorsley Hall, in front of 29 assembled guests, including 2 sitting members of Parliament and the Bishop of the county. Approximately 8 minutes before General Sir Hartley Penn stepped through the dining-room doors and asked, in the quiet, unhurried voice of a man who had commanded regiments needed continent, never once needed to raise it, who in heaven's name had put the holder of a Northern Commission commendation against the wall like a footman waiting for orders. I want you to stay with both halves of that sentence, my dear friends, the asking to leave and the asking who she was. Because everything that matters in tonight's story, and there is a great deal that matters, lives between those 2 moments, and I intend to make you feel every inch of that distance before we are through. Let me begin with the humiliation. Because it came first, and it was handled with the particular surgical efficiency that only a certain kind of woman can bring to another woman's destruction. The dinner at Gorsley Hall was the grandest the county had seen since the summer recess, assembled by Lord Gorsley in honour of General Penn's tour through the northern districts, and the guests had been escorted from the drawing-room to the long dining table in a procession of silks and starched cravats and expensive perfume. Miss Louisa Hawke had come to the dinner as companion to the Dowager Countess of Hale, a small, sharp-eyed woman of 73, who moved through society the way a chess piece moves through a board, deliberately and always several moves ahead of anyone watching. Miss Hawke had settled the Dowager comfortably among the senior guests, had seen to her shovel and her glass of warm water with lemon, and had then been directed by a harried under-butler, misreading a seating card in the dim candlelight, to a chair at the far end of the second table. She had been seated perhaps 2 minutes when Lady Portia Crowe noticed her. Lady Crowe was the variety of woman who finds her greatest pleasure not in being admired. Though she was admired, she had seen to that, but in the precise public measurement of other people's inadequacy. She had noticed Miss Hawke earlier in the evening, the plain dress of blue-grey wool among the evening silks, the quiet watchful manner, the way she fetched the dowager's shawl, and guided her arm through doorways. She had catalogued her swiftly, and filed her under something she would not have said aloud, but that sat clearly enough in her eyes. And now the woman she had filed was sitting at table among the guests, as though she belonged there. "I beg your pardon," said Lady Crowe, in a voice she pitched with the particular precision of a woman who has spent 20 years making sure the right people always heard her. "But I believe there has been a small confusion at this end of the table." She let the pause do its work. Let 29 faces turn, let the silverware stop. "The arrangements for companions and household staff are in the east parlour, I believe. The butler will show you the way, if you've lost it." There was laughter. The low, crowd-sheltered kind that people permit themselves when they are neither the one laughing nor the one being laughed at. A baronet 3 chairs down, pink with his 3rd glass of Bordeaux, remarked to his neighbour that the young woman had probably never seen a table laid with more than 4 pieces of flatware in her life, and could hardly be blamed for the confusion. Louisa Hawke was 27 years old. She had, in the course of her short life, done things that every man and woman at that table would have failed at within the first 48 hours, and she rose from her chair without a word. She did not flush. She did not tremble or glance back. She inclined her head to Lady Crowe with the precise, composed courtesy of someone who has made a decision she will not revisit, and she walked the full length of that dining room, past every watching face, and took her place standing near the doorway, where a companion could be found when the dowager needed her, and where the light of the chandelier above happened to fall, as light is sometimes kinder than people, directly upon the small silver pin she wore at the throat of her dress. It was not a jewel. It was not the kind of ornament a woman wore for beauty. It was a small oval of polished silver, not quite the width of a thumbnail, bearing the embossed seal of the Northern Sanitary Commission, a body established by Parliament to oversee the relief of epidemic disease in the industrial districts. and beneath the seal, a single engraved line that you would have needed to stand quite close to read. She wore it always. It was the only thing she owned that the world could not take from her, and had already tried. 8 minutes later, General Sir Hartley Penn arrived. He had been dining privately with his host and 2 senior officers in the library, as was his custom at such occasions, and had come through to make his ceremonial appearance among the full company before the port was served. The room rose for him, silk and starch rustling all at once, and Sir Hartley Penn moved along the length of the gathering with the measured ease of a man who has been saluted in 4 countries and finds it neither thrilling nor tedious, only ordinary. He was 61 years old, broad through the shoulders still, with a face that weather and decision had worked into something you would not call handsome, but would absolutely call trustworthy. He was passing the doorway when he stopped. The room watched him stop. The room watched him look, for a long and quiet moment, at the small silver pin at the throat of a young woman in a blue-grey dress who was standing against the wall alone. And the room heard him ask, in a voice that carried without effort to every corner of that dining room, the question that has brought us all here tonight. "Gorsley," said the general without taking his eyes from the pin, "there is a young woman standing at your door wearing a Northern Commission commendation. I have countersigned fewer than 15 of those in my life, and I should like very much to know why the holder of one of them is standing against your wall like she's waiting to clear the plates. And I am going to stop right here, with the silverware frozen and Lady Crowe's face beginning its slow, involuntary journey toward a color she would not have chosen. And a country doctor's daughter standing very still in a chandelier's light, while a general waits for someone to answer his question. Because before I tell you what that commission was, and what Louisa Hawke did to earn it, and what, or rather who, else in that room went pale when the general said her name out loud, you and I have a small arrangement to settle. Find the subscribe button and press it. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story reaches you the moment I have it ready, and I always have another ready, and they are always worth the sitting. Now come back with me 3 years, to a summer that failed. Louisa Hawke was the only child of Dr. Samuel Hawke, a country physician who served a stretch of northern England that included 2 farming villages, 4 hamlets, and 1 mill town that had doubled in population in a decade and acquired, in the process, all the crowding and open drainage that industry tends to build before it builds anything else. She had grown up beside him on his rounds, the way children raised by useful parents often do, not enrolled in the great business of keeping other people alive so much as simply present for it, holding lanterns outside cottages, reading aloud to patients who had no one else to read to them, and gradually, without anyone marking exactly when it happened, becoming indispensable. By the time she was 22, she was managing her father's books, overseeing his dispensary, and quietly running the half of his practice that ran on organization rather than medicine. She had, Dr. Hawke told her more than once and without sentiment, the 2 gifts that a physician's life actually runs on: steadiness in the presence of suffering, and the ability to look at a problem of any size and see immediately, not the entirety of its chaos but the seam of order running through the middle of it. What must be done first? Who must do it? What can be made to wait? She was 24 when the fever came through. It was a typhoid summer, the kind that begins in the river and travels the hands, and it came into the mill town in July and was a visitation by August. The mill workers' boarding houses were hit first, then the close-packed streets behind the factory, then the smaller farms where families had taken in extra mouths for the harvest season, and within a fortnight the machinery of ordinary help had broken down in the way it always does, the parish officers overwhelmed. The local gentry divided between those who sent money from a safe distance and those who simply left. And Dr. Hawke, 63 years old and one man, working 20-hour days on the plain accelerating trajectory toward being the epidemic's next casualty. So Louisa Hawke looked at the chaos, found the seam of order inside it, and took charge. She began with the old assembly halls at the center of town, a building that had hosted dances and civic meetings, and was at that moment hosting nothing, its trustees being men who were frightened, and therefore very glad to be told what to do by anyone who sounded as though they knew what they were doing. Within 10 days the hall was a fever ward of 50 beds, organized by severity, soup with a dispensary in the back room and a kitchen in the small annex that had previously housed the caretaker's tools. The business of dying, which had been scattered across 100 separate households, infecting 100 separate families, was gathered into one place where it could be fought. She recruited her nurses from the mill women, not the volunteers who came forward first, who were often well-meaning and not robust, but the women she had watched on her father's rounds, the widows, the mothers of 8 who had already lost 2, the women for whom hard work and proximity to death were not remarkable but simply Tuesday. She trained them in the plain rules, cleanliness, ventilation, the boiling of linens, the separation of the ill from the recovering. She organized them into watches, so that the ward was never without care, at any hour through the whole of that terrible summer. She wrote letters to the county landowners that mixed flattery and steel in ratios a diplomat would have respected, extracting subscriptions from men who had intended to give nothing. She organized supply lines for coal and clean water. She fixed the effective price of bread in the town by the simple method of buying flour in bulk with donated funds and selling loaves at cost from the assembly hall kitchen, so that families were not forced to choose between feeding the sick and feeding the well. She kept the books, every bed, every supply order, every death, every recovery, every shilling in and out, in a set of ledgers written in her own clear hand. And the system held. That is the plain truth of it, and I want you to understand what that means. Not a single dramatic act of heroism, not one moment you could paint on a wall. What saved that mill town was a structure, boring, methodical, and utterly without rest, that one young woman built and maintained and drove through the worst summer in that district's recorded history, on nothing more than the force of a clear head and the refusal to accept that things which could be managed ought instead to be mourned. It was into the middle of this, in the 3rd week of August, that Lord Dorian Strathmore came home. Dorian Strathmore, Viscount of Strathmore, was 31 years old that summer, and the mills at the centre of the epidemic were on his family's land, had been for 2 generations, and employed the better part of the town's working population. He had been in London when word reached him, and the thing I want to tell you about him, the thing that is the whole foundation of who he becomes in this story, is this. A great many landowners received similar word that summer, and concluded that their duty lay in sending money and staying put, which is a very comfortable place from which to feel responsible. Dorian Strathmore read his steward's letter, sat with it for one evening, and travelled north the following morning into an active fever district against the express advice of every friend he had. He arrived at the assembly hall on a Wednesday afternoon, expecting, if he was honest with himself later, which he tried to be, to take charge of the situation, because he was the principal landowner, and that is what principal landowners do. He was met at the door by a young woman with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a ledger under her arm, who looked him over once, heard his name and his intention, and had said in the tone of someone who had not slept a full night in 3 weeks and had no time left in any of them for ceremony. "I'm glad of you, my lord. We are 14 wool blankets short on the north beds, and the carter who was meant to fetch them from Belford thinks the road is too close to the infected district. Your carriage is outside. The blankets are paid for already. Can you go today?" And Lord Strathmore, who had been deferred to by every person in his life since the age of 8 when he inherited the title, looked past her at the ward she had built. The rows of beds, the organized stations, the nurses moving with the quiet efficiency of people who have been drilled, and looked back at the woman who had built it all while he was in London attending committee dinners, and said, "I can go today," and went. He came back with the blankets before dark. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and he spent the remaining 6 weeks of the epidemic inside Louisa Hawke's system, doing whatever the system needed done. He fetched and carried. He signed the subscription appeals she drafted in his name because his name could move money that hers could not. He used his rank as a tool aimed precisely where a viscount's name would open a door that a country doctor's daughter had been knocking on for a week without result. There was a coal merchant named Greer, who had cornered a significant portion of the district's winter supply, and was holding it at speculative prices while families burned furniture for heat. Louisa had tried to purchase from him twice and been refused. She arrived at his warehouse one grey morning with Lord Strathmore beside her. She did the talking. That was how they had learned to work, her argument and his consequence, because she had the knowledge and he had the name. She put the offer plainly, a fair price for a third of the store, in coin that morning. And Greer, speaking entirely to the Viscount, as though Louisa were a piece of furniture that had accompanied him, began to explain the seasonal prices and the cost of storage. Strathmore said one sentence. "You're answering the wrong person, Mr. Greer. I'm here to load the wagon." Greer looked at the lord. He looked at the woman. He performed, in the private ledger behind his eyes, the arithmetic of what it might cost him through 3 counties to be the man a viscount personally loaded coal against, and he sold at her price before noon. Strathmore loaded the first crate himself. On the road home, Louisa told him it was the most efficiently applied consequence she had witnessed all summer. He said it was certainly the most useful his rank had ever been put to, and the unmistakable air of a woman, and they laughed, sitting side by side on the wagon seat. 2 exhausted people sharing a moment of ordinary warmth in the middle of something terrible, and if you had passed them on that road, my dear friends, you would never once have suspected you were watching the beginning of one of the quiet loves I have had the privilege of telling. He understood what had happened to him in stages, the way you usually understand something that has already been true for some time. And I will give you the moment he later said had closed the matter entirely, because it is not romantic by any ordinary measure, and that is precisely why it is true. Louisa's father contracted the fever in the 5th week, as they had both silently understood he someday must. He died in 4 days, in the private room his daughter had reserved at the back of the ward, because she had thought of everything, including that. Dorian came the morning after. He had come expecting to find her undone, half hoping, he admitted to himself later with some honesty, to finally be useful in a way she needed, to step in, to manage something in her place. He found her at the ward door at 6:30 in the morning, in her working dress, with her eyes red-rimmed and dry, assigning the day's nursing rotations in a steady voice, because there were 43 patients in the beds behind her, and she was the only person alive within 30 miles who knew how to keep them there. He did not try to take over. He stood beside her and wrote down the names as she called them. He told the one friend he ever shared the full story with, years later, that he had come north that summer, believing courage was something that happened at decisive moments. At the edge of a battle, a burning building, a collapsing mine, he went south that autumn, knowing that the bravest thing he had ever witnessed was a young woman burying her father at 8 o'clock in the morning and reporting for the noon watch at 11 because there was no one else. The fever broke in September. The ward emptied slowly, then quickly, then all at once, and by October the Assembly Hall had been scrubbed and aired and returned to its trustees, and the extraordinary thing that had operated inside it dissolved by the simple and deflating fact of no longer being needed, and the unmistakable air of a woman. They had one conversation before he left for London. They walked the length of the empty ward together, on the last evening, between the bare bed Strathmore, who had faced down coal merchants and obstructive magistrates that summer without a tremor, discovered he could not locate the beginning of the sentence that actually mattered. What he said instead was that he had to return south. His land agent's affairs had compounded in his absence. Parliament was reconvening, obligations of a dozen kinds had accumulated, and that he would write, and that in the spring, when the mourning period had eased, he very much hoped he might call on her properly. And Louisa, who was 30 days from burying her father and in the middle of closing an emergency hospital, heard the shape of what he wasn't quite saying and did not trust it. Not because she doubted him, but because she had seen enough of the world to know what ordinarily became of attachments formed between a viscount and a country doctor's daughter, once the extraordinary circumstances receded into the ordinary. She said she would be glad to receive him. She meant it, and they parted at the empty ward door with a handshake, like colleagues, which is what they were, and like two people who had already decided something in their hearts and could not yet find the language for it. There was not time. Life has a particular cruelty, my friends, and it often works, not through dramatic catastrophe, but through the patient accumulation of ordinary obstacles arriving in the wrong order. Dr. Hawke's estate, it emerged that autumn, was in the condition that country physicians' estates so often are. Beloved in his district, quietly insolvent in his accounts, having provided care on credit that was never collected and mortgaged the house against the lean years to keep the dispensary running. When the debts were settled, there was nothing. The house, the practice, the instruments, all of it gone to creditors who had waited with reasonable patience and now required their due. Louisa sold the furniture, paid every obligation to the last penny, and found herself at 24 with one marketable skill, her competence, and one respectable market for it, the position of lady's companion. The post with the Dowager Countess of Hale was arranged through her father's connections, 160 miles south of everything she had known, and she took it before the first frost. The letter she sent to Strathmore's London address, informing him of her change in circumstances and her new direction, arrived during the 1 week that autumn he had gone to his estate in the north to deal with the aftermath of the fever season in his own mills. It was forwarded to London, and then forwarded again to Edinburgh, where a family matter had taken him unexpectedly, and somewhere between Edinburgh and London, it joined the great anonymous archive of lost correspondence that claimed more attachments in those years than any war. He never received it. He came back to the mill town the following spring expecting to find her. He found the house sold and the practice dispersed and no forwarding address, because a companion travels under her employer's name, in her employer's carriage, listed in no public register anywhere, and the woman who had saved several hundred lives in plain sight of the whole district had politely ceased, as if she had never stood in them. He searched for nearly a year. "I want that," said plainly, because it matters to everything that follows. He wrote to every connection her father had held. He made inquiries through every channel available to him that stopped short of setting hired men on her, which his respect for her forbade, but only just. And the plain terrible truth, the one that kept him awake in the small hours, was that a woman who had built a hospital out of a dance hall and run it for 4 months had left behind less trace in England's records than a debtor skipping a county. Now I must tell you about the pin. We are nearly caught up to the dinner at Gorsley Hall, and you need to understand what it was that General Sir Hartley Penn recognized at the door. The case of the Hawke Milltown response had become known quietly in the circles where epidemic management is discussed. The ledgers, 56 pages in Louisa's clear hand, documenting every decision, every resource, every outcome, had been reviewed by the Parliamentary Commission, established the following year to study the northern outbreak. The Commission Secretary had travelled to the Milltown personally, reviewed the records, and submitted a report that climbed, as such reports sometimes do when they are sufficiently remarkable, all the way to General Penn, who chaired the Commission and had a soldier's practical appreciation for the difference between a plan and an executed plan. The commission maintained a small commendation, struck in silver, awarded seldom and only for what the official language called extraordinary contribution to the relief of epidemic disease. 15 had been given in its history. In the winter, following the fever, Miss Louisa Hawke received the 16th at a brief ceremony in a government office in London that was reported in 3 lines in the official record and noticed by no one outside the room. General Penn had presented it himself. He had read the full report and questioned the secretary about it closely. He had held Louisa's hand a moment longer than ceremony required, and told her, in the plain unvarnished way of a man who had seen enough waste to call things by their right names, that what she had done was the difference between a managed crisis and a disaster, and that she was to wear the pin where it could be seen, because the world had a habit of forgetting what it could not look at directly, and he would not have this particular thing forgotten. She had gone back to the Dowager the same week, and she wore the pin. She wore it because he had asked her to. She wore it because it had been earned by her father's work as much as hers, and she wore it, I think, though she would have phrased it differently, as the one object in her possession that said, against the daily accumulating weight of her invisibility, I was once seen by serious eyes, and what they saw was real. She was wearing it the evening. Lady Crowe asked her to leave the table. Now, my dear friends, come back with me to the wall by the dining-room door, where a young woman is standing very still and a general is waiting for an answer. Lord Gorsley, a decent and genuinely flustered man, who had spent his evening attending to his senior guests and knew nothing whatsoever of what had transpired at the end of his second table, could tell the general nothing useful, and said so with an honest embarrassment that at least marked him as blameless, and General Penn, who had managed men in the field for 30 years and could read a room's guilty silence as accurately as a tactical map, looked down the length of that dinner table, took in its particular stillness, and understood in a moment and a half precisely what had occurred before his arrival, in every detail but the names. He did not address it directly. That was the precise and exquisite mercy of what he did instead, because a rebuke can be argued with, qualified, misremembered. An honor cannot. He crossed the room. The whole company rose and shifted in his wake, and he stopped before Louisa Hawke and said, in a voice warm enough to carry and deliberate enough to land on every person in that room, Miss Hawke, I remember you, and I remember every line of the commission report. I see you're wearing the pin, as I asked. There is a chair at the head table that has been empty all evening, and I can think of no one better suited to it than the person who produced the finest epidemic response document I reviewed in 20 years of this work. Will you come and sit with me? I have questions about the follow-up numbers, and the company at that table has been perfectly pleasant and entirely without interest. He offered his arm, and Louisa Hawke, in her blue-grey dress, in front of the assembled and now completely silent company of Gorsley Hall, took it. She was walked past the full length of that dining table, past the pink baronet, who had discovered something absorbing in his wineglass, past Lady Crowe, upon whom the general did not bestow so much as a glance, which was, as several guests agreed quietly afterward, the most thorough form of dismissal available without the use of words, and she was seated at the head table, where the conversation turned, within 5 minutes, to mortality rates and supply logistics and the peculiar administrative failures of the county magistrates in the second month of the outbreak. And she was entirely at home in it. I am told the silence in the dining room lasted nearly half a minute after she sat down. It was broken by the Dowager Countess of Hale, 73 years old, who set down her fork, looked the full length of the table at Lady Crowe, with the serene, unhurried patience of a woman who has been waiting for a particular moment all evening and has just received a better one than she dared hope for, and said to no one in particular in a voice that carried to every corner, I did suggest she wear it. but it is not the head table I want to take you into. What passed between Louisa and the general belongs to the two of them. It is the entrance hall 2 hours later. Because standing near the doorway, having arrived late from London to a dinner he had very nearly declined, and having learned within 10 minutes of his arrival the story that was already circulating through Gorsley Hall, the way good stories always circulate, rapidly and slightly improved with each telling, stood a man of 34, lean and dark and rather severe-looking, in the way of men who have not slept properly in some time, whose face had gone perfectly still when he heard the name the story attached to. Lord Dorian Strathmore had spent 2 years and 4 months learning, with imperfect success, to live with the settled conviction that he would never again be in the same room as Louisa Hawke. He did not rush to her when she came out of the dining room. Give him credit for that, because it was not easy. He understood. Even through the vertigo of seeing her alive and here and 20 feet away, that the evening belonged to her, and that a man who genuinely respected her would not spend the most public hour of her life making it about his own astonishment. He waited until the cluster of suddenly attentive guests, the same men and women who had sat silent, while Lady Crowe dismissed her from the table, now manoeuvring for introductions with a transparency that would have been comic if it had not been so perfectly consistent, had thinned. He waited until she stood a moment, apart, near the tall windows at the far end of the hall, her back to the room, her face turned toward the cold glass. Then he crossed the floor. "Miss Hawke," he said. His voice did not entirely stay steady. "I have been looking for you for 2 years." She turned. I will not pretend to you, my dear friends, that the composure which had outlasted Lady Crowe and outlasted the general's public attention entirely outlasted the sight of Dorian Strathmore's face 6 feet from hers, because it did not. The room shifted. 2 years folded up all at once. She was standing in a candlelit hall in her best dress, and she was simultaneously standing in an empty fever ward in September, saying goodbye to a man with a handshake, because neither of them had managed to find the courage for the sentence that mattered. She mastered it because mastering things was her particular genius. But he saw it. He had always seen her, and that was the first thing and the lasting thing that had mattered about him. "My lord," she said, "I understood you were in London." "I have been in London," he said, "and before that Edinburgh, and before that in the town in March, going through every address your father ever corresponded with, trying to find where you had gone. Your letter arrived at my house the week after I left in the autumn. It followed me through 2 forwarding addresses and did not arrive." He stopped then. "I spent the better part of a year proving that a woman without a public listing can vanish from this country's records more completely than a wanted man, which is a fact I intend to be angry about for a very long time on behalf of every woman it has ever happened to. I knew only that the most capable person I had ever worked beside had stepped out of every record I could find, because the records this country keeps have no column for her." He drew a breath, and what came next came out with the plain directness of something that had been waiting, under considerable pressure, for 2 years and 4 months. "I am done making my peace with any of it. I loved you at the door of that ward. I loved you every day I couldn't find you. I have just watched a general seat you at the head of his table, and I find that the only thing I want in any room I ever enter again is to not be separated from you by a city or a year or a lost letter. Marry me, Louisa. I ought to have said it in September. I am saying it now. And here, my dear friends, is where tonight's story becomes the story I actually came to tell you. Because Louisa Hawke looked at the man she had loved for 2 silent years, offering her in one sentence the end of every difficulty, the borrowed carriages, the companion's wage, the position against walls at other people's dinners, and she said, "No, Dorian, not tonight, and I need you to hear all of why." They stood by the tall, cold windows, and the muffled sound of the gathering continued somewhere beyond them, and she told him. "3 hours ago," she said, "I was a servant in this room, not because I am one, Because that is what the people in this room decided I was. On the evidence of a wool dress and a position that requires me to carry someone else's shawl, and not one person at that table said a word when Lady Crowe sent me to stand against the wall. Not one. She looked at him steadily. Then General Penn arrived, and now I am suddenly remarkable, and half the guests who watched me escorted from my seat have introduced themselves to me in the last hour as though they are conferring a favor. A pause. Do you understand what that teaches me? The world does not see a woman, it sees whatever light happens to be falling on her. 2 hours ago the light was a companion's wool dress, and I was invisible. Tonight it is a general's recognition, and I am fascinating. And if I take your hand in this hall, tomorrow the light is yours. And for the rest of my life, I will be the woman Lord Strathmore raised up. The companion he noticed, and everything I have ever done with my own hands will become the charming preface to the only thing anyone finds worth repeating, which is that a good man wanted me, and I was fortunate enough to be wanted. Her voice held, but only barely. The unbearable part, the truly unbearable part, is that I love you. I have loved you since you went to Belford for blankets without a single word about your rank. If I didn't love you, I could take your hand tonight with a clear conscience and let the world arrange the story however it pleased. It is because I love you that I cannot allow the truest thing in my life to become a lesson about patience rewarded and a generous man's kindness. I have just been handed back my own name in front of this county. I am not willing to exchange it for another one tonight, even a better one, even for love, not like this. The silence between them lasted a long moment. The music from the far rooms was a dim and indifferent thing behind it. And Dorian Strathmore stood with her refusal the way she had once watched him stand with Greer's ledger, turning it until he understood it. Not just the shape of it, but the truth of it. You're right, he said. It was quiet, and without qualification. I asked you at the single moment when my asking could have swallowed the answer whole, and I called it love, and it was love, but it was also a man reaching for what he wants at the exact moment it would be hardest for the world to see her separately from him. You have seen that more clearly than I did, which should not surprise me. You have always seen things more clearly than I have. He was quiet a moment. Then, tell me what the honest version looks like. I will not withdraw what I feel. It has outlasted 2 years and a continent, and it will outlast your refusal without difficulty. But I am asking you, as I once asked at the door of a ward, what needs doing and in what order? I have some experience following your direction. And for the first time in that whole long evening, Louisa Hawke laughed. Not the polished kind, the real one, the one he had heard 4 times in 6 weeks of fever work, and had crossed 2 years and a dozen cities without hearing since. What needs doing, she said when she had it back, is what I told the general tonight when he asked what I had done since the Milltown report. The answer shamed me, because the answer was nothing. Not for want of caring, for want of means. The system I built that summer saved lives while it operated, and then dissolved because it was built on a crisis, not a foundation. Every northern district that goes into a bad winter improvises from nothing, exactly as we did, and most of them fail. What needs doing is a permanent thing. A standing dispensary, a trained corps of nurses maintained in readiness between crises, a supply network that exists before the fever does, not after. I have carried the full design of it in my head for 2 years, complete to the last detail. I have had no more power to build it than if I had drawn the plans in sand at low tide. Then here is my answer to your refusal, said Dorian Strathmore. I will fund it. All of it, everything in your design, settled irrevocably, with one condition. Your name is on it and mine is not. The Hawke Dispensary, directed by Miss Louisa Hawke, at a salary appropriate to the directorship, with a governing board she cannot be removed from, and that I do not sit on. You will be within 2 years the most consequential person working in northern public health, in your own name, by your own work, owing me nothing that the deed of settlement will not discharge on the first day it is signed. He paused, And when that is done, when the light on you is entirely yours, from a source no one in this county can mistake, I will come north and ask my question again, as one person to another, and you may give me whatever answer is true. If the answer is still no, the dispensary stands, and I will have had the honor of being useful to you twice, which is more than most men are given. She took the offer. I hope you never doubted she would. It was, if you examine it clearly, the only offer she had ever received that asked nothing back. Not gratitude, not a name exchanged, not a story reshaped to suit a teller who was not her. And Louisa Hawke had spent her adult life knowing the difference between a gift and a purchase down to the last cent. The deed was drawn the following spring by solicitors, who declared they had never in their combined experience settled money on stranger terms. The Hawke dispensary opened in the mill town the following autumn, in a plain stone building, 2 streets from the old assembly hall, and Louisa went north to run it. I will not lay out those 2 years in detail. You can imagine the shape of them, the training of the nursing corps, the supply contracts, the ledgers kept in the same clear hand, the system built in peacetime so that it would hold when it was needed. What I will tell you is that when a lesser fever came through the district in the second winter, as fevers do, it met for the first time in that county's history an organized response that was already standing, and it broke against that response the way a tide breaks against a seawall, and was contained in 5 weeks, with losses so far below what any prior outbreak had produced that 3 physicians wrote it up in the journals, and the name in those journals, the name on the building, the name the whole northern district learned to say that winter, was Hawke. And in the spring of the second year, a carriage came north from Lord Strathmore's estate, and the unmistakable he spun. Waiting in the dispensary's entrance hall for 25 minutes, because the director was in a budget review with her supply committee, and the directors' committee waited for no one in England. He sat in the hall among the patients, his coat over his arm, perfectly content, being examined with candid curiosity by 4 small children and 1 skeptical elderly woman who had decided he was either a bill collector or a suitor and was prepared to disapprove of him either way. When Louisa came out at last, in a working dress in her own building, under a light that was entirely and unambiguously her own, he rose and said, "Miss Hawke, I believe I have a standing appointment. 2 years overdue. I've come to ask my question again, as I said I would." "Ask it," said Louisa Hawke. "Marry me," said Dorian Strathmore. "Not to raise you. You stand higher in this county than I do, and everyone in this hall knows it. Not to rescue you. I negotiated your salary myself, and I know precisely how little rescuing it leaves you in need of. I ask because I loved you at the door of a fever ward before either of us had anything. I love you now that you have everything that matters, and the only change 2 years have made is that there is no version of the story anyone could tell. No version at all, in which you are the one who was lucky." He stopped. Then, very quietly, "Marry me, Louisa, and let whatever light the world wants to use fall on both of us. I find I no longer care where it comes from, as long as we are standing in the same place when it does." And Louisa Hawke looked at the man who had heard the strangest refusal ever spoken in an English hallway, and had answered it by spending 2 years and everything he could settle, irrevocably building her a life where her yes could mean something. "Yes," she said, as one consequential person to another. "Yes." They were married that autumn in the Milltown church where her father was buried, and half the county came, and the full nursing corps of the Hawke dispensary lined the churchyard path in their grey uniforms, which made the bride weep in a way no cathedral could have managed, and she wore on her wedding dress exactly 1 ornament. You already know which one. Before I leave them there, and they deserve to be left there in that churchyard light, I must settle one small account I left open. You may have wondered, as Louisa herself wondered, why the Dowager Countess of Hale had insisted with such unusual firmness on both her companion's attendance at the Gorsley Hall dinner and the wearing of the pin. The Dowager confessed it at the wedding breakfast, over her second glass of champagne, with the particular serenity of a very old woman who has been waiting to confess something for over a year and is enjoying it thoroughly. She had known. Her late husband's family had maintained connections in parliamentary circles for half a century, that General Penn was expected at Gorsley Hall a full month before the dinner, and she had looked at her quiet, capable, and entirely invisible companion, and she had thought about those 3 lines in the official record that the world had never read, and she had made, in her own words, the last piece of considered mischief in a long and extremely well-mischieved life. "I could not make this county see you, my dear," she told the bride, patting her hand with the comfortable authority of someone who has been right about something important. "I am only an old woman. But I could make certain you were in the room wearing the evidence when someone arrived who had the standing to say so out loud. The general did the rest, and he did it better than I had dared hope. Never let anyone tell you that old women have outlived their usefulness. We are simply required to work through other people, which demands considerably more ingenuity and is therefore considerably more satisfying. As for Lady Portia Crowe, history records only that she was obliged, some years later, to be introduced to the Viscountess Strathmore at a public charity subscription, and that the Viscountess received her with a courtesy so complete, so warm, and so thoroughly devoid of any shadow of recollection that Lady Crowe was left uncertain for the remainder of her days whether she was infinitely worse, simply forgotten. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about the difference between a person and the light that falls on them, and the world's stubborn, ancient habit of confusing the two. A dining room looked at Louisa Hawke and saw a servant, because the light on her that evening was a companion's wool dress. An hour later, the same room saw a heroine, because the light had changed to a general's public regard. But she was the same woman in both lights, the same hands, the same ledgers, the same fever summer behind her, and the room's entire error, Lady Crowe's error made loudly, and 28 guests' errors made quietly, was the belief that the light was the woman. The finest thing in tonight's story, finer even than the general crossing that room, is that Louisa already knew the difference herself and would not let even love blur it. She refused the man she wanted because she was not willing to let the world refile her under someone else's name, and he loved her enough to understand the refusal, and to spend 2 years and a fortune building her a light that was entirely her own. That is not pride. Whatever the dinner tables of this world may wish to call it, that is a woman insisting on being real, and a love that can wait for a woman to be real, and then rejoices when she is the only kind that, in my long experience sitting beside this fire, deserves the name at all. If you found your way to Moonlight at Marlowe and would like to keep a seat here, the subscribe button is just below, and it costs you nothing. You have sat with me tonight through a fever summer and a dining room, and a general's question that stopped every fork in the county. If it has given you something, a warmth, a steadiness, a quiet reason to look twice at the person in the plain dress before the room decides who she is, then come back. There is always another story, there is always a fire, and I am always glad to know who is sitting on the other side of it. Good night. And the next time you see a pin, or a callus, or a steadiness on someone the room has already decided is nobody, ask, won't you? Before the room sends her to stand against the wall, there is usually a summer behind it that would silence every voice at the table. There usually is.